They told her from the first day she didn't belong, the words echoing in the barracks like a curse she could never escape, and though she swallowed her pride and pretended she didn't care, inside every muscle in her body tensed with the need to prove them wrong, because Maya Renard had not come to the front lines of this war to be dismissed as an outsider or a mistake. She remembered the way the commander's eyes had narrowed when she stepped off the transport shuttle, a thin woman with sharp shoulders and a rifle slung across her back that looked almost too large for her frame, and she remembered the quiet snickers from the other soldiers, men and women hardened by years of fighting in this wasteland who thought her presence was some bureaucratic error, some political favor pulled by someone in the capital. She said nothing, only gave her name when asked, accepted the dirt-stained cot she was assigned, and waited for the chance to prove that the uniform she wore meant as much to her as it did to them. The chance came sooner than expected, because the outpost where she had been stationed sat on the edge of contested territory, and the enemy, a ruthless coalition of mercenaries and deserters, struck within days of her arrival, testing the weak points of their defenses with brutal precision. The night was cold, the kind of cold that sank into the bones, and the alarm klaxons shattered what little rest she had managed to gather, but when she rolled out of bed, heart pounding, and snatched up her rifle, she felt none of the hesitation that had clouded her during training. She had lived her whole life with people telling her she wasn't enough, and now at last she had the chance to answer them with more than words. The trench line outside the walls was already alive with muzzle flashes by the time she arrived, and the sergeant barked for everyone to dig in, but she didn't wait for orders beyond that. She simply found her perch on the slope of sandbags, dropped prone, and locked her cheek against the stock of her weapon. Through the scope, the night was a battlefield of movement and shadows, red tracer rounds slicing arcs across the darkness, the ragged silhouettes of enemy fighters darting between cover as they pressed toward the outpost. She remembered the jeers, "You don't belong here, girl," but her finger tightened, her breathing slowed, and the first shot cracked. The recoil nudged against her shoulder like an old friend, and in the glass of her scope she watched a figure collapse, crumpling into the dust. She shifted slightly, adjusted for wind, and fired again. Another one fell. Confirmation calls lit up her comms, voices she didn't even know yet murmuring in disbelief as her shots rang out one after another, clean, efficient, unhurried, the rhythm of someone who belonged exactly where she was. For every sneer and doubt she had endured, she found a target, and for every target she found, her rifle answered with cold finality. The assault dragged on for what felt like hours but was in truth only minutes, and by the time the enemy finally pulled back, leaving bodies sprawled in the dirt and smoke drifting in the frozen air, Maya's kill count had climbed high enough that the sergeant himself stopped at her position, crouched beside her, and looked at her as though he were seeing her for the first time. He said nothing at first, just studied the precision of her shots marked in the wasteland beyond, then finally muttered, "Not bad, Renard." It wasn't much, but it was more acknowledgement than she had been given in weeks, and though her face betrayed nothing, inside she felt a quiet fire begin to burn brighter. She knew the war would not end here, nor the doubts of those who refused to accept her, but she also knew she had carved her first mark into this brutal place, and marks had a way of spreading, of changing stories told around mess halls and barracks. She returned to her cot at dawn, too exhausted to remove her boots, and when she closed her eyes, she dreamed not of home or peace but of the weight of the rifle in her hands, steady and certain, as though it alone had reminded her that she belonged. The days that followed blurred into drills, patrols, and the uneasy silence of waiting for the next assault. But for Maya the memory of that first night clung to her like a second skin, a reminder that she had stepped onto the battlefield not as a guest but as someone carved into the stone of survival, though the others still watched her with cautious eyes, unwilling to fully trust what they had seen. She heard their whispers in the mess hall, caught fragments of conversations cut short when she walked past, sensed the weight of doubt pressing from every direction, but she did not argue, did not waste breath defending herself. Instead she kept her rifle clean, her boots laced, and her mind sharp, because she understood that words would never change their opinion, only action repeated over and over would silence them. The outpost sat at the edge of what used to be a thriving city, now reduced to skeletal ruins and ash, and every night the horizon glowed faintly with the fires of skirmishes further out, while the wind carried the distant thrum of artillery like some endless storm that refused to pass. Patrols through those ruins were tense affairs, the kind where every shadow seemed to breathe and every broken wall could conceal death, and though her squad leader tried to assign her rearguard positions, hoping to keep her away from the worst of it, Maya always found a way to shift forward, to place herself where the danger was sharpest. On the third patrol, they walked through the skeleton of what had once been a cathedral, its shattered spires stabbing the sky, and the enemy came from nowhere, sudden as a trap snapping shut, gunfire erupting from upper windows and the shattered choir loft, cutting down 2 soldiers before anyone could react. The squad scattered for cover, voices shouting into comms, but Maya did not scatter. She dove to the floor, rolled behind a slab of fallen stone, and lifted her scope toward the loft, her breathing a calm counterpoint to the chaos. One target appeared, muzzle flash giving him away, and she dropped him clean, then another leaning out from the shadow of a broken pillar, and she adjusted, fired, watched him fall. Her squad leader's frantic voice barked orders, trying to regroup, but as seconds stretched into minutes it was Maya's shots that steadied the line, each one tearing holes through the ambush until the remaining enemy pulled back, retreating into alleys with their wounded. When silence finally returned, broken only by the ragged breathing of survivors, the squad leader turned toward her, his expression unreadable beneath grime and sweat, and for the first time he did not question her presence. They made it back to the outpost with 2 dead but many more alive than would have been, and as the report went up the chain of command, Maya's name was attached to phrases like instrumental and decisive, words that tasted like vindication though she never spoke them aloud. That night, in the barracks, one of the older soldiers, a scarred veteran who had sneered most loudly at her arrival, sat on the edge of her bunk and handed her a tin cup of something hot, and though he said nothing, the gesture spoke louder than any apology. Yet even as respect began to take root, Maya knew the war itself had no intention of offering her rest. The enemy had marked the outpost as weak and more assaults came. Sometimes probing, sometimes ferocious, and each time she took her position on the line, steady behind her rifle, each time proving again and again that she was not a mistake. Still, inside her, a different storm brewed, because she had come here not only to prove herself to strangers but to silence a voice buried deeper, the voice of her own father who had told her when she enlisted that she would break within weeks, that she did not have the hardness for a soldier's life. She remembered the final argument before she boarded the shuttle, the way he had turned away as though ashamed of her choice, and every time she lined up her scope and confirmed another kill, she thought of him, thought of the words, "You don't belong," and let the crack of her rifle serve as the only reply he would ever need. Sleep came in fragments, restless and shallow, and sometimes she woke with her hand still curled around the phantom shape of her rifle's grip, but she did not fear exhaustion. She feared insignificance, feared being forgotten or dismissed, and that fear drove her harder than any drill sergeant ever could. When the call came for volunteers to join a forward reconnaissance team pushing deeper into contested ruins, she was the first to step forward, not waiting for permission, not hesitating, and though her squad leader tried to hold her back with the excuse that she was still too green, command overruled him because they had already read the reports, already seen the numbers beside her name. As she prepared for that mission, tightening straps, checking ammunition, listening to the rumble of engines as armored carriers warmed outside, Maya understood that belonging was no longer the prize she chased. Belonging was already hers, etched in the respect of her peers and the acknowledgement of her commanders. What she chased now was something else entirely, something darker and sharper, a hunger to carve her mark so deeply into this war that no one, not even the ghosts of her past, could deny she had been here. The reconnaissance mission began under a pale dawn, the sky stretched thin and gray as though reluctant to reveal what lay ahead, and Maya sat wedged between 2 veterans in the back of the armored carrier, her rifle resting across her knees while the vehicle bounced over the fractured terrain. The rhythm of the engine steady but the silence inside tense, because everyone knew recon wasn't about discovery so much as it was about bait, about drawing the enemy out and surviving long enough to report back. She kept her eyes down, tracing the grooves of her weapon with her thumb, but her mind was sharp, cataloging every motion, every face, the twitch of the driver's jaw, the slow breath of the soldier to her right, the smell of oil and sweat and fear that clung to the cabin. When the carrier finally stopped at the ruins of what had once been a marketplace, they disembarked in tight formation, boots crunching over shattered glass and burned stone, and the sergeant leading them raised a fist for silence. The city was dead but not quiet. The wind pushed through hollow windows, rattling bits of metal and cloth, carrying echoes that could mask footsteps or whisper of danger. They moved cautiously, clearing corners, advancing through alleys where once vendors had shouted prices for fruit and cloth, and Maya felt the ghosts of civilians pressing against her awareness, lives erased by years of war. It was there, in the skeleton of a collapsed building, that the ambush fell, sudden and merciless, a dozen enemy fighters pouring from hidden recesses with rifles blazing. The first burst of fire tore into one of the veterans beside her, spinning him to the ground with blood on his lips, and instinct shoved her body low, rolling behind rubble as bullets sparked against stone. Her scope rose, her breath narrowed, and the first target filled her sight. She squeezed, the shot cracked, and a man dropped. The squad was pinned, shouts erupting in comms, but Maya did not wait for orders. She shifted angles, found another silhouette, another muzzle flash, and dropped him, her mind cool even as adrenaline flooded her veins. She crawled along the edge of cover, shifting constantly, never letting her position be fixed, and every time she fired another body fell, until the weight of her precision began to tilt the fight. Yet the enemy was relentless, more appearing from side streets, pushing forward with the confidence of numbers, and for the first time since she'd arrived at the front Maya felt the edge of fear, the cold reminder that no skill could hold back an ocean forever. Her squad leader barked for a retreat toward the carrier, but when two soldiers made a run for it, gunfire cut them down before they cleared the square. Something in her chest clenched, not despair but fury, the old voice whispering you don't belong trying to rise again, and she crushed it beneath the mechanical rhythm of loading, aiming, firing. She found high ground on a half-collapsed staircase, braced her rifle, and became a wall of steel, covering her squad as they regrouped, her shots carving holes into the advancing line until the enemy began to falter, their momentum broken by the sheer brutality of her accuracy. Confirmed kills, someone muttered over comms, disbelief thick in his voice, and though she didn't answer, the words fed the fire in her lungs, pushing her to hold her ground. At last the surviving enemy pulled back, dragging their wounded, leaving silence thick with the stench of cordite and blood. The sergeant approached her, his armor scuffed, his expression unreadable, and for a long moment he simply looked at her, then gave a single sharp nod. It was enough. They had lost 3, saved the rest, and as they loaded the bodies into the carrier for the grim ride back, Maya sat in silence, her hands steady but her heart heavy, the reality of war pressing into her bones. That night, when the debrief ended and the commanders praised her actions, she lingered outside beneath the stars, her rifle slung against her back, and wondered if belonging was worth the faces of those who hadn't made it. Yet even with that weight pressing down, she knew she would go again, deeper, further, wherever the fight led, because every shot she fired wasn't just against an enemy, it was against every voice that had ever told her she was unworthy, every barrier meant to keep her small. She had tasted the strange clarity of the battlefield, the place where hesitation meant death and resolve carved survival, and she knew there was no turning back. The weeks after the ambush carved themselves into Maya like scars beneath the skin, each patrol, each skirmish, each night spent listening to the wind scraping over the ruins layering on a weight that no amount of sleep could shake off, yet with every mission she carried herself taller, sharper, her rifle becoming less an object and more an extension of her body, as natural as her heartbeat. Respect was no longer given grudgingly, it had become silent, steady, unspoken but clear in the way the others glanced at her during briefings, the way no one second-guessed her when she volunteered for point, the way even the sergeant now paused to hear her thoughts before assigning positions. But belonging had a cruel price, and the front had no mercy because while she had silenced doubts, the war had begun to hunger for more, and the enemy, angered by the losses she had inflicted, began to adjust their tactics. On a bitter night under a blood-red moon, the outpost came under its heaviest assault yet, waves of fighters swarming from 3 sides at once, mortars slamming into the barricades, fire and dust choking the air until the line wavered and nearly collapsed. Maya was on the northern wall, her scope flashing in the chaos, every squeeze of the trigger adding another body to the battlefield, but there were too many, the ground crawling with shadows that seemed endless. Soldiers shouted, medics dragged the wounded back, commanders screamed into radios begging for artillery support, but through it all Maya stayed prone, calm, methodical, cutting down enemy after enemy, her kill count climbing past anything she had ever imagined, until even the machine gunners paused between reloads to glance at her, disbelief etched in their faces as though they were watching not a woman but a force of war itself. She felt the world narrow to the glass of her scope, the rhythm of her breathing, the recoil against her shoulder, until hours seemed to dissolve into seconds, and when at last the horizon broke with the thunder of Allied reinforcements and the enemy scattered into retreat, the outpost stood battered but unbroken. Bodies littered the field, both friend and foe, the smell of blood thick enough to cling to her skin, but what struck Maya most was the silence that followed, the way every eye on the line turned to her, not with doubt, not with ridicule, but with something she had never thought she'd earn, awe. The sergeant clapped a hand on her shoulder, rough and heavy, muttering words she barely heard over the pounding in her head, but it was the look in the soldier's eyes that burned deepest, the way they seemed to draw steadiness from her presence now, as if she had become a pillar they leaned on. Yet even as her reputation grew, inside her a shadow crept, because the more she proved herself, the more she realized proving herself had become the only language she spoke, and every night she closed her eyes she saw the same faces she had ended through her scope, strangers who had once believed as fiercely in their cause as she did in hers. She told herself it didn't matter, that survival was the only truth here, that belonging meant doing whatever was necessary, but still she sometimes lay awake on her cot, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she was proving herself to others or if she was still trying to silence the voice of her father. That voice haunted her even now, whispering in memory, telling her she didn't have the strength, that she was chasing something she would never catch, and though she had silenced the outpost, silenced her squad, silenced even her commanders, she could not silence him. When the next orders came, sending her squad beyond the safety of the outpost to secure a relay tower deep in contested ground, she volunteered without hesitation, knowing the mission was perilous, knowing the enemy would not let them advance without blood. They moved through ruins scarred by countless battles, skies choked with ash and smoke, and Maya walked at point, her eyes scanning every shattered window, every rooftop, the weight of her rifle steady in her hands. It was there, beneath the shadow of the tower, that the ambush came again, heavier and deadlier than before, enemy forces erupting from hidden trenches, their gunfire shredding the first line of cover and scattering the squad. Maya dove behind twisted metal, firing back, each shot precise, but even as she cut down one target another appeared, the battlefield alive with muzzle flashes and screams. She heard her name shouted, orders barked, but her mind narrowed once again to that familiar clarity, that cold focus where there was only target and trigger. Her shots carved a path, holding the line, buying seconds for her squad to regroup, but she knew this was different, knew the enemy had come prepared not just for a fight but for her. They had learned, adapted, spread themselves wide to force her to move, to expose herself, and in that moment she felt the old words rise again, "You don't belong," but instead of crushing her they became fuel, a defiance that burned hotter than fear. She shifted position, crawled through debris, found a new angle, and fired until the ground was littered with the proof of her resolve. Hours later, when the tower was finally theirs and the survivors gathered in the ruined lobby to take stock, the squad leader looked at her with something like reverence, shaking his head as though he couldn't believe one person could carry so much of the fight. Maya didn't answer, didn't smile, didn't gloat. She simply cleaned her rifle in silence because for her the battle wasn't over, not here, not within. The relay tower mission earned them temporary breathing room on the front, the enemy's communications faltering under the loss. But victories in this war were never permanent, and Maya learned quickly that every success carried the seed of the next bloody challenge, because the enemy adapted as fast as they bled, and commanders were greedy for momentum, always pushing further, demanding more from those who proved they could deliver. Her name began to circulate beyond the outpost, whispered in other units, passed along through radio chatter like a ghost story half believed, the girl who didn't belong but whose rifle sang like thunder, the marksman whose confirmed kills stacked higher than some entire squads. Maya didn't care for reputation, she carried it like a weight she couldn't shrug off, because with each rumor came expectation, and expectation was dangerous in a war that crushed even the strongest without warning. She kept her focus simple, clean the rifle, stay alive, protect the squad. Yet she couldn't ignore how the squad itself had changed around her. Men who once dismissed her now sought her position in firefights, choosing cover where her scope could shield them, women who had muttered doubts now asked her for advice on sight alignment, veterans who had sneered now carried her extra ammunition without being asked. Belonging had not been granted, it had been taken, carved into them with every shot she fired. Still, belonging did not silence the war inside her, the war with her own doubts, and at night she often thought of her father, of the way he had turned away, of the final words he had spoken that cut deeper than any bullet. "You'll come back broken if you come back at all." She imagined his face if he could see her now, lying in rubble with smoke in her lungs, calm as steel as bodies fell through her scope, and she wondered if even then he would refuse to admit she was more than he believed. The next mission pushed them deeper still, escort duty for a convoy carrying supplies critical to holding the sector, and though escort sounded simple, everyone knew convoys were death traps, slow-moving targets that drew ambushes like moths to flame. Maya walked beside the lead truck, rifle at the ready, eyes scanning the ridgelines, every muscle tense with anticipation. The road wound through a valley of broken concrete and rusted steel, the skeletons of towers looming on either side, and the silence was so thick it screamed of danger. When the first rocket slammed into the rearmost vehicle, turning it into a fireball, the valley erupted with enemy fire, figures spilling from the ruins above, bullets raining down in a storm meant to shred everything below. Soldiers scattered for cover, shouting, the convoy grinding to a halt, and Maya dove behind a half-buried slab of road, scope already rising, finger already finding the trigger. Her first shot cut a machine gunner off a rooftop, The second silenced a grenadier before he could aim, the third cracked through the skull of a rifleman leaning too far from cover. The valley was chaos, explosions shaking the earth, shouts of wounded mingling with the roar of engines, but through it all Maya's rhythm never broke, her breathing steady, her shots surgical. She moved like a shadow, sliding along debris, finding new angles, always forcing the enemy to second-guess where death would come from next. The squad rallied around her presence, her fire creating pockets of breathing space, her precision cutting holes into the ambush until what had begun as certain slaughter became survival. Yet survival came at a cost. 2 trucks destroyed, 6 soldiers dead, more wounded, and by the time they pushed through the valley and limped back to friendly ground, every face was lined with exhaustion, grief buried beneath the relief of still breathing. That night, as the dead were laid in rows and tagged, Maya sat apart, her rifle across her knees, staring at the flames licking the sky where the destroyed vehicles still burned. Others murmured her name again, voices filled with something between gratitude and disbelief, but she barely heard them. She thought only of the silence that followed battle, the silence that pressed hardest, the silence where her father's voice always found her. She had belonged on the battlefield now, proved it 100 times over, but the question that clawed at her chest was whether belonging in war meant losing the right to belong anywhere else. She brushed the thought away with the same mechanical precision she used to clean her weapon, but the unease lingered, growing heavier with each mission. And yet, when orders came again, when command called for volunteers for another push, she was the first to step forward, because hesitation was death, because belonging had become not just proof but purpose, and because she could no longer imagine silence without the crack of her rifle cutting through it. The next push came faster than anyone expected, orders snapping through the outpost before soldiers had even scrubbed the last blood from their armor, and Maya found herself once again loading magazines in silence, her hands moving with mechanical certainty, her mind sharpening like a blade before it is drawn, because she knew by now that each mission was less about survival and more about inevitability, that the war would keep grinding until nothing remained to grind, and only those willing to carry their weight without hesitation stood a chance of carving meaning into the chaos. Their objective was a power substation buried deep in enemy territory, a relic of the old world that still fed energy to scattered defense grids, and intelligence reported that the enemy had begun fortifying it as a stronghold. Taking it meant severing their grip across the sector, but it also meant walking into teeth sharpened by desperation. The squad moved under cover of night, slipping through ruins that whispered with every gust of wind, their boots crunching glass and ash, weapons raised at every shadow. Maya took point as always, her scope sweeping, her instincts humming like a live wire. She felt the city breathing around them, broken but alive with danger, and when the first shot cracked from the darkness it did not surprise her. Bullets screamed from hidden nests, cutting down 2 soldiers before the rest dove for cover, and the street exploded into chaos, tracer rounds flashing, grenades bursting against old stone. Maya rolled into position, rifle rising with the smoothness of ritual, and through her scope the battlefield unfolded. Muzzle flashes, flickers of movement, shadows betraying life where none should be. She squeezed, fired, shifted, fired again, each kill a note in the cold song she played better than anyone, her body moving before thought could catch up. The enemy pressed hard, emboldened by numbers, but the squad had learned to lean on her fire, their movements flowing with hers, their survival bought in seconds she carved with each shot. They pushed through alley after alley, blood and smoke marking their path, until the substation's jagged silhouette loomed ahead, lit by the harsh glare of enemy floodlights. The final approach was madness, machine guns sweeping the street, mortars slamming into shattered rooftops, voices screaming orders and pain into the comms. But Maya did not falter, did not blink. She crawled through rubble, braced her rifle and dismantled gun nests one by one, each shot a scalpel cut into the body of the enemy's defense, each confirmed kill dragging the squad forward another desperate meter. Her world narrowed to that scope, that trigger, that steady rhythm of breath and recoil, until time itself blurred, and when the squad finally breached the substation, storming its gutted halls with rifles blazing, Maya's body was already coated in dust, sweat, and the strange calm that came only in the eye of the storm. Inside, the fighting was close and brutal, rifles replaced by knives, grenades, fists smashing into helmets, the air a choking mix of cordite and blood. Maya moved through it with cold clarity, her rifle still firing in short bursts, her knife flashing when enemies appeared too close, and when at last the last shot echoed and silence fell, the substation belonged to them. The price was heavy, 4 more dead, several wounded, but command's voice crackled with triumph over the comms, declaring the operation a decisive victory. The squad slumped in exhaustion, gathering among the flickering lights of the captured stronghold, and for a long moment no one spoke, the silence filled only by ragged breathing and the dripping of broken pipes. Then, as if pulled by the same thought, eyes turned toward Maya again, toward the woman who had once been told she didn't belong but who had carried them through hell and fire. She sat in the corner, cleaning her rifle with blood-stained hands, her face unreadable, and though she did not seek their gaze, she felt it, heavy and reverent, a weight she both craved and despised. Later, when reinforcements arrived and the dead were carried out, the commanders praised her name again, attaching it to words like indispensable and irreplaceable, and though she nodded, though she accepted the weight of medals she did not care for, inside she felt something hollow growing, a question that gnawed at her whenever the battlefield went quiet. Was she proving she belonged, or had she simply become a weapon, no different than the rifle in her hands, valued only so long as she could keep firing, disposable the moment she faltered? That night she couldn't sleep, sitting alone in the gutted substation, staring at the stars through a shattered ceiling, and she thought of her father again, thought of how he had told her she would come back broken, and wondered if perhaps he had been right, only not in the way he imagined. She wasn't broken from fear or weakness, she was breaking from being needed too much, from carrying too many lives, from becoming something less than human and more than a soldier, a miss she had never asked to be. And yet, when the call came at dawn for another advance, she stood, slung her rifle across her shoulder, and walked toward the fight without hesitation, because hesitation was death, and because in the end, belonging to the war was the only belonging she had left. The battlefield had shifted into a nightmare landscape of smoke, burning wreckage, and the constant rattle of gunfire echoing across the broken terrain. Elena pressed her back against a shattered concrete wall, her rifle balanced carefully in her grip as she scanned the ruins ahead. Her breathing was controlled, steady, each inhale and exhale timed with the rhythm she had drilled into herself over years of training. She could hear the others shouting in the distance, the men who had once told her she did not belong here, their voices now tinged with desperation as they struggled to hold their ground. She had already proven herself 100 times over in the past days, her rifle lighting up with confirmed kills, but the battle was far from finished, and survival was still balanced on the edge of a blade. Her earpiece crackled with a voice, harsh and panicked. "They're pushing through the east flank. We need cover now." She shifted quickly, peeking past the wall. Through the haze she spotted movement, shadows darting between twisted metal beams and collapsing rubble. They were fast, coordinated, not reckless like the first waves. Whoever was commanding them had finally realized brute force wouldn't work, and now the enemy was moving like predators circling prey. Elena crouched lower, pressing her cheek against the stock of her rifle, finger tightening slightly on the trigger. She didn't shoot immediately, she tracked them, waiting for the precise moment when exposure met her sights. One broke cover, running low with a weapon drawn. Her shot cracked sharply, echoing across the battlefield. The figure dropped instantly, his body sliding into the dirt. Another attempted to pull him to safety and she fired again, dropping the second before he even reached the first. Her kills weren't just numbers. Each one shifted the flow of battle, buying her side precious seconds to regroup, forcing the enemy into hesitation. She had been underestimated since the first day she arrived here, but now every pull of her trigger carved her place deeper into the reality of war. She was no longer an outsider. She was the shield holding the line. Her squad's leader, a grizzled veteran named Kale, shouted her name across the comms, his tone no longer dismissive. "Elena, keep them pinned. We're moving reinforcements to your sector." She didn't waste breath with a reply, she just moved. Rolling to a new angle, she perched on higher rubble, ignoring the sting of stone shards biting into her knees. She fired again, the shot kicking against her shoulder, smoke curling from the barrel. Each enemy that fell seemed to silence the doubt that had once haunted her, but there was no time for pride. The wave was still coming. A sudden blast shook the ground beneath her, the force knocking her flat. Dust clouded the air, making her cough violently as her ears rang with the deafening echo. Through blurred vision, she spotted the glowing streak of enemy artillery shells tearing into what remained of their defensive line. Men screamed, scrambling for cover, some never making it before the explosions ripped them apart. She dragged herself upright, pain searing through her arm where debris had grazed her. Her hands trembled, but she forced the fear down, forcing her mind into calm. If she faltered now, if she hesitated, they would all be overrun. She pulled her scope back up, wiping grime from her eyes. A hulking figure emerged from the smoke, armored heavier than the rest. He carried a weapon designed to mow through soldiers in seconds, and his visor glowed with a menacing red light. The moment Elena saw him, she knew this was not a regular enemy. This was one of their commanders, maybe the one who had driven the new strategy. Her breath steadied and she exhaled slowly, whispering to herself, "One shot." She lined up the sight, ignoring the chaos around her, the distant shouting, the blasts of artillery. Her finger pressed the trigger. The shot rang out clean. The commander's helmet jerked violently, sparks flying, and he staggered. She adjusted instantly, firing again before he could regain balance. The second bullet punched through the weakened armor, and his massive frame crumpled into the dirt. A collective roar of relief burst through the comms, her squad rallying with newfound energy. By taking him down, she had fractured the momentum of the enemy push, and she knew it. But she didn't celebrate. Her jaw tightened as she reloaded swiftly, scanning for the next target. In war, there was no pause between victories. More enemies hesitated now, retreating behind cover, and her allies took advantage. Kale's squad surged forward, unleashing fire to reclaim lost ground. "Nice work, Elena," his voice barked in her ear, but this time there was respect in his tone, not doubt. "Keep pressing them." She obeyed without hesitation, firing, moving, covering angles the others couldn't see. Her rifle was an extension of her will, every shot deliberate, every kill necessary. The battle dragged on for what felt like hours, but gradually the tide turned. The enemy that had once stormed confidently now scrambled, pulling back in disarray. The once overwhelming force began to fracture under the relentless defense, their formations collapsing as panic spread. Elena felt sweat trickle down her temple beneath her helmet, but her focus never wavered. She had bled for this ground, and she would not let it be taken. At last, silence began to settle. Smoke hung heavy in the air, but the gunfire diminished to sporadic bursts before fading completely. The enemy was retreating, their bodies littering the ground as a grim testament to the clash. Elena lowered her rifle slowly, her arms trembling from exhaustion, her shoulder bruised from hours of recoil. She let out a deep breath, one she hadn't realized she had been holding. Around her, soldiers stumbled to their feet, their expressions dazed but alive. Some cheered weakly, others simply collapsed from exhaustion, but all eyes kept darting toward her. Kale approached, his face streaked with grime and blood. He stopped in front of her, his gaze locking on hers. For a long moment he said nothing, simply studying her as though seeing her for the first time. Finally he spoke, his voice low and firm. "They said you didn't belong here. They were wrong. Without you, this line would have broken an hour ago." The admission carried weight, heavier than any metal. She gave him a small nod, her lips pressed tightly together. Words felt unnecessary. Her actions had already spoken louder than anything she could say. As the medics rushed to tend to the wounded and the engineers began fortifying what remained of the defenses, Elena stepped back from the group. She looked out across the battlefield at the smoldering wreckage, the still forms of friend and foe alike, and felt the ache in her chest that always followed victory. She had survived again. She had proven herself again. But she knew deep down that tomorrow or the day after, another wave would come, and she would once again lift her rifle, once again hear the words echo in her mind, "You don't belong here," and once again answer them with every shot that found its mark. The courtroom had turned into a theater of revelations. By the time the last witness sat down, the faces of the HOA board members looked like masks cracking under heat. Karen, once smug and domineering, had lost the edge in her posture. She sat hunched, lips pressed tight, eyes darting back and forth as if seeking an escape that didn't exist. The judge cleared his throat, his voice resonating with authority that silenced the whispers in the room. "The evidence presented today leaves no doubt in this court's mind. The actions of this HOA, and specifically those directed by Ms. Karen Whitfield, were not just improper, they were unlawful. This board abused its power to intimidate, extort, and strip rightful property from its owners. That ends today." Murmurs of approval rippled through the gallery. Neighbors, people who had once stayed silent out of fear, now sat straighter, their expressions brighter, emboldened by the judge's words. My father sat beside me, his uniform gleaming as if it had soaked up the weight of the moment. His calm demeanor belied the fire in his eyes. He had waited patiently for this reckoning. Karen stood suddenly, her voice shrill and desperate. "This is unfair. I built this community. Without me, this neighborhood would have fallen apart. You all should be thanking me." The judge slammed his gavel once. "Sit down, Ms. Whitfield." But Karen wasn't finished. "This man," she pointed directly at my father, "has manipulated all of you with his rank, with his so-called heroism. You're blinded by his medals and his stories. He doesn't care about this neighborhood. He just wants to control it." My father rose slowly, the quiet power of his presence instantly filling the room. He didn't shout, he didn't accuse, he simply spoke, each word measured like a soldier giving his final report. I did not spend decades in service to this nation for control. I did it for protection, for order, for justice. The same principles apply here. You abused power, Karen. You took from these people, bullied them, and believed no one could stop you. That ends not because of me but because the truth always finds the light. The silence that followed was crushing. Karen's face twisted, her arguments dissolving into nothing. She collapsed back into her chair, her confidence extinguished. The judge announced the verdict with clarity that seemed to echo against the walls. Effective immediately, this HOA board is dissolved. All fraudulent fines and liens will be nullified. The properties wrongfully seized will be returned. And Ms. Whitfield, your actions fall under criminal fraud and harassment. You will answer for these charges in a higher court. The sound of the gavel striking wood wasn't just the end of a case, it was the breaking of chains. When the courtroom doors opened, the sunlight spilling into the hall felt different, warmer, freer. Neighbors clustered together, shaking hands, clapping backs, sharing smiles that had been absent for years. The air itself felt lighter. One elderly couple approached my father, tears brimming in their eyes. "You don't know what you've done for us, General," the man said, voice trembling. "We thought we'd lose everything we built. You saved us." My father simply nodded. "You saved yourselves. You stood up. Don't forget that." As Karen was escorted out in handcuffs, she cast one last venomous glance our way. But there was no bite left in her. The crowd barely noticed her departure. They had already moved on, already begun reclaiming their pride. We walked together back toward the cabin. The land stretched out before us, unchanged yet entirely transformed. Every tree, every stone seemed to hum with renewed meaning. This was not just property. It was home. My father slowed his steps and turned to me. "Do you understand now?" I frowned slightly. "Understand what?" "That land, that cabin, it's never really about wood or soil. It's about what it represents. Stability. Freedom. Responsibility. That's why I fought for it and why I'll keep fighting." He placed a firm hand on my shoulder. "Someday this will be yours to protect." The weight of his words settled deep in my chest. For the first time, I felt the full gravity of what had just transpired, not just a battle against corruption but a lesson in legacy. That evening, the community gathered near the lake. For the first time in years, there was laughter carried on the wind instead of whispers of fear. Someone lit a fire, and neighbors brought food, music, and stories. Children ran across the grass, their carefree joy like a symbol of the fresh chapter that had begun. I sat by the water, watching the flames flicker in the distance, when my father joined me. He carried 2 mugs of coffee, handing one to me. "You did well today," he said. "I didn't do much," I admitted. "You listened, you learned, and you stood beside me. That's more than enough." The water reflected the stars, each ripple scattering their light into fragments. It struck me then that this fight, as exhausting and intense as it had been, had forged something unbreakable between us. "Do you ever regret it?" I asked quietly. "Serving all those years? Carrying all that weight?" My father stared at the horizon for a long time. "No. Because every burden teaches you strength. And every fight for what's right reminds you who you are." He took a sip of his coffee, the steam curling into the night. "Karen thought power came from control. But real power, real strength, comes from standing firm when others can't. Remember that." Weeks later, the official paperwork arrived. The cabin land, the water rights, the road, all restored, uncontested, untouchable. The community elected a new council, one built on transparency and trust. And Karen? She faded into obscurity, her name now spoken only as a cautionary tale. The cabin thrived once more. Repairs were made, not just to the wood and stone but to the spirit of the place. Neighbors stopped by often, not out of obligation but out of genuine camaraderie. Where fear once lingered, fellowship had taken root. One afternoon, as I stacked wood by the porch, my father called out from inside. "Son, come here." I stepped into the living room. He stood by the mantel holding a small, weathered box. When he opened it, I saw medals, patches, and insignias neatly arranged. "These are pieces of my life," he said softly. "But they don't belong locked away. They belong to you, to remind you of the cost of standing tall." I felt a lump rise in my throat as he pressed the box into my hands. The weight of it was heavier than metal, it was history, sacrifice, and love combined. "I'm proud of you," he said. And in that moment, I knew the fight against Karen and the HOA had given me more than just land, more than just victory. It had given me purpose. The story of Karen's downfall spread beyond our community, becoming almost mythic in tone. The HOA Karen who went too far became a tale told with both humor and warning. But for us it wasn't just a story. It was a turning point. Because in the end it wasn't about titles or power or even revenge. It was about people standing together. It was about a father teaching his son what true strength looks like. And it was about a community rediscovering that home is not just where you live. It's where you fight, where you endure, and where you belong. As the fireflies lit up the twilight and the sound of neighbors' laughter carried through the night air, I realized something. The battle was over. The war was won. And the legacy of that victory would live on, long after the memory of Karen had faded. The end.